going to go mute it back there, so don't say anything.
Okay. Happy National First Ladies Day to you. Yes. Now, I've had to say this the last couple of years because this is new territory. So the proper thing to say when someone says Merry Christmas to you, you say what to them? Merry Christmas, that's right. Some of you are awake, some of you are still half asleep. But somebody says Happy National First Ladies Day to you, you say, oh, see, you learned it in Marshfield first. That's great. Which is appropriate since Marshfield's the birthplace of National First Ladies Day. I'm so excited to introduce this play this morning and to tell you kind of a little of the history behind it. My good friend, one of my best friends, Dr. Larry Cook, has been working behind the scenes on this collection Francis Carpenter since he acquired it, and has been piecing together information, and we've been speaking throughout the process, and I was just fascinated with the stories he was sharing to me from Francis Carpenter's diary. And so he had great plans to put together a book, which he has done. And I said, Larry, you need some way to promote the book as you take it across the country. You know, not everybody's a history nerd like we are. And they need to know about Francis Carpenter. He's fascinating. So one night I couldn't sleep in the middle of the night, and I thought, this story needs to be told through a play. And then maybe Larry can use this play as he takes the book across the country to help educate people just at a different layer than just with his book. And so thus was born, you know, you get crazy ideas when you cannot sleep in the middle of the night. And so thus was born this play, and I hope that you will enjoy it. And then I was so excited when I called Ray Toler, and I said, Ray, can you bring Francis Carpenter to life? He said, well, send me the script, I'll read through it. And he actually said yes. He didn't hang up the phone on me, which was great. So today you're here for the premiere. I'm so excited about that. And then Larry is also having to share some exciting news this morning about his book, and I'll let you speak further about that.
Thank you, Nick, and good morning. And when Nick says that we're best friends, it's true. We even say we share a brain because I think about him and then my phone rings and vice versa. So just quickly, I wanted to tell you, some of you may have seen me last year talk about this a little bit, but how this came about was, as you know, I'm a presidential historian, and Diane and I have one of the largest collections of presidential memorabilia in the country. And it just so happened to be, I was a chief officer on a fire department years ago when I was much, much younger. And a man that I served with there was a captain on the fire department. And he used to tell me back then, knowing that I was into presidents, that, hey, my great-great-grandfather was a famous artist and he has paintings in the White House. So since I've gotten this career over the last several years of being a presidential historian, he contacted me. He's from central New York. We live in northeastern Pennsylvania. And he said, hey, I got to talk to you about the stuff that's been passed down through my family from my great-great-grandfather. And when he told me his great-great-grandfather's name, Francis B. Carpenter, I almost fell out of my chair because being a historian, I knew who that was. Famous for painting the Lincoln reading the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. and that now hangs in the U.S. Capitol. And Diane and I were just in Washington 2 days ago, and it's in a secure area of the Senate, and we pulled some strings and got to go there and see the painting hanging there. It was a very emotional experience for me because I've spent 2 years of my life going through this collection, and we got the collection from my friend. He wanted it to go to us. There's 48 years of diaries handwritten by Francis Carpenter. We have 8 paintings. We have his printing blocks. We have, it's just amazing. It goes on and on and on with this collection. And he was one of the, Carpenter was one of these guys that I always say was the hand behind history because he made so much history. And he was an amazing man, able to talk himself into the White House to live with Abraham Lincoln for 6 months. And that wasn't the only time he was at the White House. He painted everybody famous in his time. And so it's really amazing story, and I could go on and on and on. But it will be in my new book, which will be out within, I've been saying within 2 weeks. I'm going to say within a month just to be safe. But it's called Brushes with History. Francis B. Carpenter in his own words. And what we did is we took those 48 years of diaries and we divided them up into 10 chapters. And then I do like a running biography of Francis B. Carpenter. But during those sections of years, we published the diary exactly how he wrote it, with misspellings and all for some of the time. And so it's been a massive, massive undertaking. I was telling Nicholas that when we saw the painting the other day, I had tears running down my cheeks because I feel like I've lived with this guy for the last couple of years, and to see his work right in front of me was just amazing. So we really hope you enjoy the play. I know you will. We have a sign-up sheet. Unfortunately, we don't have the book out yet, but there is a sign-up sheet out there with some of my other books that I've written. But you can sign up and pre-order a book, and then we'll contact you when it comes in and make arrangements to get a signed copy shipped to you. We're excited because the book has already gotten national attention. Michael Burlingame and Harold Holzer, who some of you may recognize the names, are the 2 world's leading experts on Abraham Lincoln, and they both contacted me this week, one with a phone call, one with an email that says, when can we see this book, and can we collaborate with you on something with it? It's been folklore with this collection. My friend had it hidden away, and people like Holzer and Burlingame knew the collection was out there, but they didn't know where it was. And so they are overjoyed. So with that being said, I so appreciate my new friend, Ray Toler, in doing this for us and portraying Francis Carpenter, who has been in our house for the last 2 years. Ladies and gentlemen, Ray Toler.
There's a smell to oil paint that never quite leaves a man. Gets on your clothes, on your hands, and if you're not careful, on your very soul. My name is Francis Bicknell Carpenter, and I am an oil painter and an author. During the course of my life, I've had the opportunity to paint many great men. Millard Fillmore, John Tyler, James A. Garfield, Franklin Pierce, all men who carried great weight in their times. Presidents, authors, clergymen, editors, poets. But there's one painting that has hung over my life like a shadow. That's the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation by President Lincoln. And that painting has followed me all of my life. But before Lincoln, before the White House, there was this young boy in Homer, New York, who wanted to be an artist. And that young boy learned something very early. Faces tell stories. A painter's not merely an artist. He's a witness to the moment. He studies the eyes, the mouth, the set of the shoulders, the cut of the brow. And if Providence is very kind to him, he may achieve a likeness. But if he's really kind, he may achieve something deeper than a likeness. He may catch the character. And so, from my earliest years, I was drawn to the faces of the men who were shaping the country in which I lived. Not because they were famous, but because history was washing over them. And I wanted, with whatever skill God had given me, to be able to capture a portion of that moment and keep it from vanishing. Oh, one of my earliest paintings was of President Millard Fillmore. I started to write my diary, and I wanted to capture every instant, every moment, every emotion of the journey. September 30th. Started this morning for Washington with a commission to paint President Fillmore. At any rate, the next morning I presented my letter of introduction. He received me kindly and arranged for me to paint in one of the rooms of the White House. The president invited me to dine with him. His family was away in the north, so he did the honors himself. And I wrote in my journal here that he was dignified, without formality, pleasant, courteous, at ease. You know, there is something significant about seeing a man away from the crowds. One learns that the office magnifies whatever is in the man. Ceremony may surround him, but it does not create him. Oh, also while I was in Washington, I went to see Mount Vernon. Standing before the tomb of George Washington, it stirred emotions in me that I can't fully describe. The resting place of the father of our country seemed so humble, too humble for such a man. Yet there was something sacred about it. I wrote here that millions yet unborn would visit that place. You know, I believe they have. That's one of the mercies of a republic, because great men are not hidden away from us. They belong to the people. Here's a memory from those early years that has always amused me. One evening, while painting Secretary William Marcy, a knock came on my door. Now, I thought it was a servant or a friend, so I shouted out rather casually, "Come in!" The door opened. Who should stand there? President Franklin Pierce. Well, immediately I began apologizing for greeting him so informally. He just laughed, and he said that was quite all right. He said he had come personally to invite me back to the White House to continue my work. You know, not many painters can say that the President of the United States came knocking on their door, but that is precisely what occurred. And he seemed greatly pleased with my work. I was struck then, as I often am now, by how much kindness and simplicity may dwell in a man that history mainly remembers by holding the office. President Pierce told me a story from his youth. He said that as a boy, he had met President Andrew Jackson, and Jackson laid a hand on his shoulder and said, my boy, one day you will be president of the United States. Well, now, he didn't tell this as a boast, but more like a strange providence, because it came to pass. History often moves like a painter's brush. One stroke and destiny appears. Later, I conceived an idea of a great historical painting. Not a mere likeness, but not a painting on some parlor wall, but a grand historical work. I wished to paint the moment when President Lincoln read the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. The more I reflected on this, the stronger grew my desire. In my memoir here, I wrote, the proclamation was an act unparalleled for moral grandeur in the history of mankind. That's still my conviction. I felt then, as I've written elsewhere, an intense desire to do something expressive of the war. Now, not the war as a conflict, but the war as a moral struggle. So with the help of friends, I eventually gained access to President Lincoln. His face was worn with care. And there, he invited me to a reception. By happy coincidence, I met William O. Stoddard, the president's private secretary. And by a lucky coincidence, he had come from my hometown, Homer, New York, and that proved to be a grand bridge and helped me quite a lot. Later that afternoon, I did attend the reception, and there I saw Lincoln for the first time. He was tall, his shoulders slightly stooped. His face was worn with care. And his expression was grave. It wasn't severe. When I caught first sight of him, a profound feeling of sympathy and respect passed through my whole being. Mr. Stoddard introduced me to the president, and he said that I was the artist from New York, and the president said he remembered. Then he straightened himself up to his full height, and he asked with a playful expression on his face, "Do you think you can make a handsome portrait of someone with a face like mine?" I said, "Mr. President, it's my job to do a good one." He laughed at that. And I learned that there was no vanity in him. You know, he often joked about his own appearance. He always had some kind of a gentle self-knowledge. You know, he seemed to know all of the oddity of his features and to have made peace with them. And that first exchange with the president told me a great deal. He did not hide behind his office. And he put a man at ease almost instantly. And thus, I began my 6 months in the White House. Now, this was in 1864, and the state dining room became my studio. Can you imagine that? Where once formal dinners had been held, now stood my grand 9-foot by 15-foot canvas. Sketches filled the room. Cabinet members came and went. Secretaries came down the corridor. Visitors peered in. And sometimes the president himself would come in and observe. You know, to live in the White House at that time was to see two Abraham Lincolns. First, there was the public Lincoln, the president of a nation at war, the man to whom delegations came daily with petitions, complaints, arguments, accusations, and endless requests. Then there was the private Lincoln, The man who stood looking at my canvas in thoughtful silence. The man who, he would begin telling a story before he had even fully seated himself. He was a man whose face could turn from sorrow to humor in an instant. He possessed a remarkable sense of humor. Many times I heard him tell stories that just relieved the strain of war from older men. There were occasions when those grave men sat burdened with politics, war, appointments, policy, and the atmosphere in the room grew so strong it seemed oppressive. In such moments, the president would often begin a story, not to avoid the matter, not to cheapen it, but to loosen the tightness of men's souls. I observed that when Mr. Lincoln found the opportunity to laugh, he took it. He could tell a story with the straightest face possible without even cracking a smile, while the rest of us were convulsed in laughter. And then, just as suddenly, he would turn around again and go back to the matter at hand with perfect gravity. Now that is one of the most remarkable powers I have ever seen in my life. So you see, there's a problem with what people think about the president. He knew that truth came in easier through the side door of laughter than through the front gate of debate. And I came to see that that was one of the ways he survived his office. Without his humor, I doubt that he could have endured the war. Yet beneath all of that humor, there was a great sorrow. He spoke to me of his son, Willie, and how Willie's death had greatly affected him. I remember one occasion here when his voice softened when he referred to the boy, and he said to me, "Willie was too good for this earth." I've never forgotten the expression on his face when he said that. And he didn't dwell on it for long because he never indulged in sorrow before others. But there are griefs which settle permanently in a man's face. And no artist who ever looked upon the president after that, honestly, could fail to see that this event was one of them. To paint Lincoln truthfully was not merely to paint his features, but it was to paint his burden. Another thing that impressed me greatly was the accessibility of the president. Men imagine power always surrounded by distance and ceremony, but I found President Lincoln astonishingly open. He received all manner of people, office seekers, ministers, soldiers, widows, politicians, crackpots, eccentrics. At times I marveled that anything ever got done. But he endured it. There was in him an almost inexhaustible patience for the common man. I remember thinking once that his greatness lay not only in his intellect, but in his sympathy. He listened. Even when interrupted, he listened. Even when he was tired, even when the petitioner was foolish, he listened. And a gift like that is rarer in public life than intellect. Oh, Mr. Lincoln came into my office came into my studio one day while the work was progressing. Sometimes he just stood before the canvas and looked. And sometimes he made a brief remark, but sometimes he would come in silently, look at the painting, look at me, look at the painting, look at me, with some kind of a half smile, half frown expression on his face that I could not forget. If he approved, he did so quietly. If something amused him, it showed in his eyes, not on his face. He studied the likenesses of the various cabinet members. He knew each man too well to be careless in his judgment. But one cannot paint the cabinet members just as if they were a row of heads. There are relationships among faces. All of these must be suggested: authority, rivalry, habit, irritation. And if the painting is going to breathe, we must have those features. And Mr. Lincoln, seeing these men every day in the trials of war, recognized each one in the spirit in which I had placed them. And that gave me a great satisfaction. As I said, the state dining room became my studio, and it also became, in a sense, a crossroads of the Lincoln administration. Men came here to sit, to observe, to converse, and I like to work from life whenever possible. But I was forever adjusting. I was forever wondering what would happen. It was laborious work. Often I had to refer to these photographs by Matthew Brady. Each figure in the painting, in my mind, must not only resemble itself, but it must hold its proper relationship to all of the other figures in the painting. And yet, even with all of this care, I'll show you, I was forever adjusting and changing. All different. There were moments when the president appeared utterly worn out. He would sink into his chair and sit. Visitors would leave him. The room would empty out. And the president would sink into this chair with the weariness of a man who had carried the weight of a nation. You know, it's one thing to admire a statesman from afar, but it's quite another thing to see what that has cost him. I saw Mr. Lincoln as not merely thought, but endurance. I saw not merely intellect, but patience. I wrote not merely leadership, but sacrifice. And his face at rest was often sadder than his words. And that's why I say again, to paint the president is to paint his burden. During my work in the White House, I arranged for these photographs to be taken of the president by Matthew Brady's studio. He sent a photographer named Anthony Berger, and that was on April 26, 1864. The photographs were taken at the president's office and also in his cabinet room. And the purpose of them was to help me in finishing my painting. But you know, photography in those days was quite different, and it required no small amount of apparatus and inconvenience. So we had to set up a temporary darkroom in the White House. Young Tad Lincoln, mischievous as boys often are, managed to gain access to the door to the darkroom. He got in there and locked the photographer out. We pounded on the door. He would not come out. I had to interrupt the president in a cabinet meeting to come and intervene. Finally, he came and the president was trying to get him to come out. Can you imagine the president of the United States banging on a door saying, "Get out, get out"? And that delay damaged the plate of the photograph. It made a strange smear on Abraham Lincoln's face. Such small domestic happenings were part of White House life. The gravest affairs of state on one side of the door and the mischievousness of children on the other. Mr. Lincoln often came into my studio while his work was progressing. Sometimes he would make a brief comment, and sometimes he just looked at the painting. My friend, engraver John D. Felter, drew this cartoon of the situation and published it in the newspaper. But as I said, there were moments when the president sunk into weariness. Yet despite it all, there remained in him a singular gentleness. The harshness of war never fully consumed his humanity. Perhaps that's one of the things that impressed me both about him. When the painting was nearly complete, Mr. Lincoln brought his cabinet in to observe the work. They gathered around the canvas, and Mr. Lincoln examined it thoughtfully. He made a few general remarks about the likenesses. He observed the figures of his cabinet officers carefully, and he recognized each man instantly. His manner was never boastful or theatrical about it. He spoke simply, as though the painting represented not his own importance, but the importance of the moment. That was always his way. He never seemed enchanted with his own place in history. If anything, he seemed almost detached from it, always concerned with his duty rather than his glory. Later, we exhibited the painting in the East Room of the White House. Many visitors came to see. It was thronged with visitors. And yet, I must confess, as the artist standing there, I was never fully satisfied with it. I continued to see all of the faults. I continued to think, no artist is ever quite finished with a painting, especially one that he's imagined in his mind. He just merely stops working on the picture in front of him. But after the exhibition, I labored to find a future for my painting. I campaigned for Congress to purchase it, but they didn't appropriate the money. Years passed. At last, in 1877, I convinced Elizabeth Thompson, a wealthy widow who was using her husband's fortune for philanthropic endeavors. I convinced her to purchase a painting for $25,000 and to donate it to Congress. So in 1878, on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, a joint session was held to receive it. And there I stood, the artist, present at the formal reception of my work that I had done in the White House under the very eye of the man himself. That was no small moment for me. Whatever dissatisfaction I had was restrained. I could not but feel gratitude that the painting had at last found a permanent national home. Then in 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated. The news struck the nation like a thunderbolt. I took this original study I did of Lincoln. I just sat looking at it. In my diary here, I wrote, "I had a good cry." That phrase was plain, but the grief wasn't. The grief was immense. In my journal, I wrote about attending memorial gatherings. I wrote verses that were printed in the newspaper. Then on April 25th, I witnessed the grand procession, funeral procession in New York City. I wrote here, "New York never saw such a day." And you know, I believe that remains true. Thousands upon thousands, thousands upon thousands, moved by one sorrow. The death of Mr. Lincoln did something very rare in public life. It united the nation in grief. Strangers became, for one moment, one people. Later, I received a message from Mary Todd Lincoln. She wrote to me that the portrait of her husband was so lifelike, she could barely stand to look at it. She also confessed that she hung it in an odd place. But that was praise of the most painful kind she gave me. To succeed as a portrait painter, and then by that success, having painted a portrait that was too accurate that the widow could not stand to look at it. Oh, she also sent me a memento, this cane. It belonged to President Lincoln. She described it as very plain, but it does have his name inscribed on it, and he did handle it. You know, there are objects which become precious not because of their beauty, but because of their nearness. I wrote back to Mrs. Lincoln with gratitude, and I told her that this cane would remain among my most prized possessions, and I believe it has. I've often thought that art and memory are connected. A portrait is not a body, it's not a voice, it's not even the living presence of a man. And yet, by some mercy, it may preserve enough of the man that brings forth the rest in the mind. It's a face remembered, an expression recalled, a character half felt. And you know, that is no small thing. A painter does not raise the dead, but he may keep forgetfulness from claiming them. If he's witnessed greatness, and I mean true greatness, it's his obligation to be honest. Not flattering, not false, honest. History remembers presidents. They remember generals and statesmen. But sometimes I hope history remembers the man who just happened to be in the room. I didn't command armies. I made no proclamations. I was simply a painter. But for 6 months, I lived in the White House. And I watched a man carry the burden of war and the burden of a nation. I saw him in labor. I saw him in laughter. I saw him in sorrow. I heard the stories with which he eased the souls of burdened men. I saw the lines on his face deepen under the agony of war. I came to understand that greatness does not appear in splendor. Sometimes it appears in patience. Sometimes in weariness. Sometimes in a lonely man who was raised up in a terrible hour. Ladies and gentlemen, my grand painting. I was never fully satisfied. I didn't like it. I revised it in my mind 1,000 times. I wish to change details, strengthen this and soften that. You know, artists are often tormented by the distance between their vision and their result. But on my better days, I allow myself one comfort, that perhaps in some measure I have preserved not merely the likenesses of Abraham Lincoln, not as a marble statue, not as a legend, not as a cold monument, but a living man who was raised up in a terrible hour. If I can do that, my labor has not been in vain. And as that young boy from Homer, New York learned, a portrait is more than a painting. A portrait's a memory, and a memory is the nearest thing we have to immortality. Thank you. Thank you.